that line, 20 years ago, Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty introduced players all over the world to its unique blend of near-future dystopian sci-fi, hard-boiled spy, detective mystery, and plausibly realist military speculative fiction.
Russian choppers.
The Russians in question, who begin the game hijacking an oil tanker and brutally butchering its deck full of Marines, fly in on a particular kind of Russian military transport helicopter. Twin-engined Kamov Ka-60 Kasatkas, also known as the Killer Whale. And so begins MGS2's specific focus on members of the former Soviet armed forces, like Olga and Sergei Gerlukovich, and their struggle to survive in the capitalist US-centric world that the Soviet Union left in its wake and that MGS2 at large goes on to portray.
Your part in the mission is complete. You are to leave at once.
No, it's not over yet.
I can see the moon, even in this storm, pale as death. I have a bad feeling about this mission. You swore this to me, that you would leave the unit once the mission was complete. Do not worry, this is a country of liberty.
No, this is where I belong, with the unit. I have nowhere else to go. Father, I want to stay and fight.
There is no choice to make here, Olga. Need I remind you that you are carrying my grandchild? You will be on the helicopter out of here now.
As just one random example of how multi-layered and inside Kojima's writing tends to be, especially in MGS's case, when it comes to corresponding with the real world. This is a brief video essay focusing just on the significance behind Gerlukovich's forces historically as stand-ins representative of a deeply shameful era in the annals of recent modern history, namely the dissolution of the Soviet Union. More specifically, what was done or not done to take care of things afterwards. Close inspection reveals Russian flags on the Kasatkas' tails, while Gerlukovich's forces sport a kind of camo called Russian KKO Woodland Brown. According to Camo HQ, the KKO, an acronym for this Russian phrase here, originated, quote, in 1992 for use primarily by MVD Special Purpose Brigades. Tanker, MGS2's opening chapter, presents as parallel characters the commander of the Russians, Gerlukovich, and of the Marines, Commandant Scott Dolph. Even their names are kind of similar, Sergei and Scott. Fittingly, then, the KKO pattern, in a reflection of the changing status quo after the end of the Cold War, was actually, quote, loosely based on the US M1948 ERDL or Woodland Camo pattern. While equipped with AK-74Us and infrared goggles, the Russians actually utilize, in Tanker, a blitzkrieg-like siege tactic that originated with US and British special forces known as fast roping. It's how commandos of every flag today tend to enter a landing zone when landing isn't an option. Meanwhile, the type of plastic explosive that they use to sink the Discovery, the Semtex, it's an Eastern Bloc weapon, made infamous by the Lockerbie bombing of 1992 and other similar acts of international terrorism. It traces its lineage to the covert support provided by the Soviet Union to the Viet Cong throughout the mid-20th century, and to other similarly related communist-backed Third World insurgencies. All this military history and trivia, it's well and good, but as we'll cover now, the relevance of the former Soviet military personnel present in MGS2, down to their gear, it only becomes clear by a close and somber reading of relatively recent history. Near the end of MGS2, Olga fills us in on what happens to her unit in the 2-year gap between Tanker and Plant. During our first encounter, Olga, who was really going through some things then, spent most of that fight loudly justifying to herself the recent decision to betray her father's will.
I've been with the unit since I was born. I grew up on the battlefield. Conflict and victory were my parents. The unit is my life, my family.
Olga refused to abandon her unit, the one she was born into and would ultimately be destined to lead. But only through a hidden intel report from Rose and Pliskin respectively, along with what Olga will later tell us, do we get a concrete and full sense of who Sergei Gerlukovich and his unit ever even were to begin with, let alone where they wind up under Olga's leadership. That's because, like most entries in this series, MGS2 has a lot of hidden content.
What do you think you're doing, Snake? You don't have enough to keep you busy?
Keep in mind, also through this section, the themes introduced by Sergei's unit in the prologue, the themes of Russian brand nationalism and organized crime.
I thought you were the leader of the Russian troops.
No, that was just a smokescreen.
A smokescreen?
I was sent to provide you support.
Support? Who sent you? The Colonel?
No, the Patriots.
What?
I deceived my troops, betrayed them.
But why?
My child is being held hostage by the Patriots. It all started 2 years ago when I lost my father during the tanker incident. My men and I had nowhere to go, so we joined forces with an illegal Russian organization.
The Russian Mafia?
Something like that, actually. I learned much later that it was a subordinate organization of the Patriots.
What do you intend to do with Ray? Sell it on the streets?
I was raised in Snezinsk, formerly known as Chelyabinsk 70, the nuclear research outpost.
What are you talking about?
After the Cold War ended, my home was bought out by the Americans.
Is there a point to this sad story?
Now you would understand. Land, friends, dignity, all sold to the highest bidder, the United States of America. Even the technology that gave birth to these weapons is Russian, developed by us.
What do you intend to do?
Russia will rise again. And Ray is the key.
Sergei Gerlukovich may die at the end of MGS2's prologue, but he goes out a living legend. He was born, according to the game's script, roughly 70 years before the prologue in 2007, meaning just around the start of the Second World War. Sergei is from Snezinsk, formerly Chelyabinsk 70.
It was once the deadliest lake on Earth. At the moment the Soviet Union collapsed in a cloud of broken communist dreams, Lake Karachay was likely the most contaminated site in the former USSR. A storage place for radioactive waste material generated by the Mark nuclear facility in the closed city of Chelyabinsk 40, Karachay had spent decades accumulating a level of toxicity unparalleled in history.
And the sea will turn into a toxic soup for centuries, becoming the worst environmental disaster in history.
This was not only a nuclear research outpost, it was arguably the research outpost for the Soviet Union's next-gen nuclear weapons program. Although it should be noted that just as in MGS2, we find a fierce, if peaceful, rivalry there, somewhat similar to the one in MGS2 between the Navy and Marines, between the central plant at the site, the All-Russian Institute for Theoretical Physics, or VNIITF, and its own rival, the All-Russian Scientific Research Institute of Experimental Physics. Since this isn't a video on MGS2 and the history of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program, let me just say that most of the advances made by the Soviet Union in hydrogen bombs and other important innovations besides came from one of these two research centers. Yet despite its historic importance to the evolution of humanity's most dangerous meme, you wouldn't have found Chelyabinsk's name so much as on a brochure prior to it, both the city and the research center it housed, being disclosed by the former Soviet Union in 1992. The site of Chelyabinsk 70, once known as Scientific Research Institute or NII 1011, housed, according to globalsecurity.org from the year 2000, plants 1 and 2, quote, for manufacturing experimental and pilot units of nuclear warheads, end quote. This, of course, can't help but bring to mind the Big Shell and its secret nuclear platform arsenal gear. Sergei grew up to head single most iconic Cold War Special Forces outfit, the Spetsnaz GRU, and then with the collapse of Soviet communism, it all fell apart. Sergei became a big boss-esque figure, the leader of a mercenary army without a country, and that's when he began to plot to restore Russia and its armed forces to their former glory. His old unit's motto, "Only the stars are above us." Now, in that Soviet collapse, what MGS2 was subtly evoking or alluding to all along was that a massive contingent within the former Soviet military command structure began to turn to crime to make ends meet. On top of that, thanks to the Afghan war, drug addiction and the drug trade became epidemics, not just in Russia or Afghanistan, but all along the edges of the former Iron Curtain. Everything from contract killings to selling off old tanks and jets and loose nuclear materials unaccounted for on the black market, these things became relatively everyday events. Corruption wedded to the Russian government, political and military infrastructures, so that by the tail end of the 90s, the U.S. Foreign Military Studies Office, based in Fort Leavenworth, would be calling the new class of post-Soviet Russian military officers, quote, mafia in uniform. This is actually hinted at rather obliquely by MGS2 with the Kamov Kasatka choppers, the military and civilian models being Ka-60 and 62. Think for a second what kind of world it is that we're living in, that there is that much civilian demand for a military transport helicopter. Virtually any paramilitary force with enough money could buy one. And in the era this chopper was made, the late 90s, many if not most such armed armies without nations in the Russian region were certainly either themselves or involved with former Soviet military. Now, the actual Kasatkas, at the time of MGS2's creation, they were little more than prototypes. Their unique motor uses that special shrouded tail or fenestron rotor, which Snake, precisely because it doesn't make any noise, because it essentially makes the Kasatkas stealth helicopter gunships with much quieter rotor noise. That's why he instantly recognizes them. The Kasatka was initiated as a prototype all the way back in the year 1984 to replace the Mi-8, which itself used, like the military revision of the Kamov, a 5-blade rotor ever since 1964. Yes, there's a traceable lineage to these helicopters, these weapons, a self-replicating meme in the terminology of one, not Darwin, but Dawkins, going all the way back to the MIL-1, USAF/DCD reporting name Type 32, NATO code word HARE, which first took flight September 1948. Helicopters, an iconic part of the backdrop in George Orwell's novel 1984, as much as the entire Metal Gear series, got their start in World War II. And if any of this seems weird, I'm just trying to showcase the idea of memes to some extent, and do so in a playful, creative way. Yet again, in a great illustration of why Kojima's saga is so brilliant, the helicopter became ubiquitous as a modern weapon, thanks in part to its propagandistic sense of peace. According to the aficionado Tim Chrisman of the University of Alaska Fairbanks physics program, in part, quote, thanks to these aerial ambulances, the death rate of wounded was the lowest in Korea of any previous war. Though technically President Truman never declared war, Korea was similar to a degree to the American response to civil conflicts in the former Soviet Union in the 1990s, triggered by great power politics. Korea had been a consequence of the collapse of the Japanese Empire, while the fighting in places like Chechnya, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Croatia were, just like the dissolution of the Red Army, caused by the Cold War's withering away, in tandem obviously with myriad other internal problems, perhaps inherent to the Soviet system, their system for societal sanity. And I refer here, of course, to communism. In the script for MGS2, when near the end, Olga explains her decision to work with Snake as one of mutual gain. Kojima, in the liner notes, if you will, notes, quote, Raiden is a little surprised to hear that comment coming from a native of a communist country, end quote. Contrast her new outlook here with Sergei's 2 years prior, who spoke only derisively of America's capitalistic mindset. Clearly, MGS2 depicts an age of incredible transition, but also one of uniformity. An age where, ironically, not in spite, but because of the end of its shadow antithesis, Soviet communism, American brand capitalism became simply the de facto global state of things, and thereby lost its own means of self-determination. Our identity sold, like the wider world, to a network of highest bidders. This loss, it's of what MGS2 calls context. Ironically, you see the collapse of the Soviet Union was like a perfectly timed and placed structural demolition. Demolitions, we're told by MGS2, being a kind of ideology, which makes, as a rule, no exceptions, no matter the ideology, for time or place. With the world's concept of the not America, the Soviets, exploded, soon enough down came the entire Cold War and even soon enough post-Cold War superstructure, at least the one that existed in the 1990s. That seismic change occurred, exploded, just about a month before the release of MGS2, the game which debuted in November of 2001. But this dramatic paradigm shift, in hindsight, was as good as complete once America lost its point of contrast, the Soviet Union. A binary system, after all, by its nature relies both on 0 and 1. Nation-states at the millennium's turn were, as so epitomized by the revanchists, besieged terrorists, and American-style revolutionaries found in MGS2, marked for death as far as context goes. The nation-state context was disappearing, consigned to the trash heap of history, much like the Soviet Union. After all, not only is the Cold War over, it looks as though, for a time anyway, that all war, as the 20th century and before understood it, is just as extinction-bound. In the wars of this new, both Pax and post-Americana ages, war would become part of its own necessary load-bearing binary, alloyed together with peace, emerging as criminalized warfare, private warfare, organized crime. All of this is being hinted at simply by the paramilitary criminal elements, criminal sort of dimension to Gorlukovich's forces throughout the game. The UN-backed Korean War-esque police actions throughout the 1990s, they had a dark underside, a dark twin, the rise of global terrorist finance networks, and with them private military shadow economies, all of them memetic heirs to the original analog, the trade of drugs. Like Liquid says to Snake, and the Patriots say at the end of MGS2 to all of us, so long as the light exists, in so many words, our light will cast its shadows. Our demons won't die, can't die, why we and our angels still exist. And yet, we can't exist without them either. To see what it's like when both light and darkness, that is to say, context, are snuffed out, look only to the Russians and Central Asians in the wake of the Cold War. Former communist officials and sentinels like Gorlukovich transformed into plutocrats, would-be mafia bosses, and revenge-obsessed revolutionaries overnight. Crime became the last battlefield, the last place soldiers born in their fires could still remember as something like home. Until next time, boss.